Daniel stood quietly in his work clothes, coiling a rope on the deck of his own yacht, when his ex-wife's husband pointed at him and laughed. 15 years later, you're still someone's errand boy. Daniel said nothing. He simply looked toward the captain standing a few feet away. And in exactly 10 seconds, the captain was about to say two words that would make Daniel's ex-wife realize exactly whose yacht she'd been standing on the entire afternoon. Before we get into tonight's story, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because tonight's story is one that's going to stay with you long after it ends, especially once you see what happens on that yacht. Daniel Ashford had spent the last 15 years building something almost nobody outside a small circle of engineers and executives knew existed. To the world, he was a quiet, private man who kept a low profile, avoided cameras, and rarely appeared in the business press, despite running one of the most respected names in luxury yacht manufacturing. Ashford Marine Holdings had grown, quietly and steadily, from a single revolutionary hull design Daniel had sketched out on graph paper in a cramped boatyard office 15 years earlier, into a global company whose technology now sat beneath the decks of some of the most expensive vessels on the water, licensed by manufacturers on 3 different continents. Daniel never advertised his success, never sought recognition, and to this day insisted on personally inspecting his flagship yachts before any private charter, a habit born less from necessity and more from a quiet, stubborn pride he'd carried with him since the earliest, hardest years of building this life from nothing, back when nobody believed his obsession would ever amount to more than sketches on scrap paper. That morning, Daniel stood on the deck of one of his newest vessels, dressed in simple work clothes, a faded gray shirt and worn canvas pants, running his hands along a section of railing while checking a small mechanical adjustment before the day's scheduled charter. Exactly the kind of quiet, hands-on work he still preferred over sitting behind a desk in some corporate office. He looked, to anyone who didn't know him, exactly like what he'd once actually been 15 years ago, a working man with rope-worn hands and salt in his hair, comfortable in the kind of quiet, physical labor that had defined his entire early life before Ashford Marine Holdings ever existed. He preferred it this way, preferred the anonymity of simple clothes and simple tasks, because it let him move through his own company the way he always had, unnoticed, uninterrupted, exactly himself, without the weight of a title following him around every deck he stepped onto. What Daniel didn't know yet, coiling that length of rope near the yacht's stern, was that today's charter belonged to his own son. Eli, now 22 years old, had booked the vessel through a charter company for his birthday celebration. Thrilled to have found what he believed was simply a beautiful yacht available for the day, with absolutely no idea that the company behind it, and the boat itself, belonged to his own father. Eli had invited a small group of close friends, along with his mother Vanessa and his stepfather Marcus, hoping for an easy, celebratory afternoon on the water. The kind of milestone birthday he'd been looking forward to for weeks, having saved carefully for months to make this particular day feel special. Daniel, for his part, rarely tracked which specific charters filled his calendar each day, trusting his booking staff completely, which meant he had no idea whatsoever that his own son would be stepping onto this exact yacht within the hour. The guests arrived shortly after 10 that morning, Eli leading the group up the gangway with visible excitement, Vanessa and Marcus following close behind, dressed the way people dress when they want a day on the water to feel like an occasion worth remembering. Vanessa in a light summer dress, and Marcus in the kind of casual linen shirt he reserved for special occasions. Vanessa looked around the yacht with quiet appreciation, admiring the polished teak decking and gleaming brass fittings, while Marcus, walking a step ahead of her, scanned the vessel with the kind of appraising glance men give things they wish they could afford themselves, doing quiet mental math on what a day like this must actually cost. Neither of them paid much attention to the man in simple work clothes near the stern, adjusting something along the railing, assuming without a second thought that he was simply part of the yacht's crew. Exactly the kind of person who existed in the background of days like this, present but unimportant, easy to overlook entirely. If you've ever been completely misjudged by someone who never bothered to actually look at you closely, go ahead and drop a comment about it, because what happens in the next few minutes on this yacht is something Marcus is going to regret saying out loud for a very long time, and there's absolutely no taking it back now. It was Marcus who spoke first, drifting toward the stern with a drink already in hand, clearly feeling emboldened by the easy luxury surrounding him. He looked Daniel up and down, taking in the worn clothes and rope-calloused hands, and said, loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear clearly, a smirk spreading across his face as he spoke, the kind of comment he probably thought was harmless enough to laugh off later. 15 years later, and you're still someone's errand boy. Vanessa, standing a few feet away, let out a short, surprised laugh before she could stop herself, more from the shock of Marcus's boldness than any real cruelty, though the sound still carried sharply across the open deck and drew a few curious glances from nearby guests. Daniel looked up slowly from the railing, and for one long, quiet moment, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger exactly, but the strange, disorienting recognition of hearing his ex-wife's laugh again after 15 years, standing just a few feet away from him, without any idea who he actually was. Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply straightened up, set down the small tool in his hand, and turned his gaze toward the yacht's captain, who stood near the helm a short distance away, quietly observing the entire exchange with an expression that had already shifted from mild curiosity to unmistakable alertness, the kind of look a captain gives when he realizes exactly who's just been insulted on his own deck. Marcus, taking Daniel's silence as confirmation of his own assumptions, chuckled again and turned slightly toward Vanessa, clearly pleased with himself, already moving on toward the next moment of the celebration without giving the exchange a second thought, reaching for a passing tray of appetizers as though the matter were already settled and forgotten. Eli, standing near the yacht's main cabin doorway, hadn't quite caught what his stepfather had said, distracted by a conversation with one of his friends, completely unaware that the next few seconds were about to reshape everything he thought he understood about his father, his family, and the very yacht he was currently standing on. The captain crossed the deck at an unhurried pace, his posture straightening the closer he got, until he stopped directly in front of Daniel and inclined his head with clear, practiced respect. "Mr. Ashford," the captain said, his voice carrying easily across the now quieter section of deck. "The engine adjustment's been logged, sir. Should I have the crew prepare the vessel for departure, or would you like a few more minutes before we head out?" For one full second, nobody moved. Marcus's smirk froze halfway across his face, the drink in his hand suddenly forgotten entirely. The appetizer he'd just reached for still untouched on its little napkin. Vanessa's laughter died in her throat as her eyes moved slowly from the captain's face to Daniel's, a slow, dawning horror beginning to spread across her features as the pieces started, unwillingly, to click into place, 15 years of assumptions collapsing all at once in the span of a single sentence. And Eli, turning at the sound of the captain's voice, felt his own stomach drop as he registered, all at once, the name Ashford, the word Mr., and the unmistakable, impossible realization that the quiet man in worn work clothes his stepfather had just mocked in front of his entire birthday party was somehow, impossibly, standing there as the owner of the very yacht they were all currently floating on. The same man he'd called Dad his entire life without ever once understanding what that name actually meant. For a long moment, nobody on that stretch of deck said a single word, the only sound the quiet lapping of water against the yacht's hull and the distant murmur of guests near the bow who hadn't yet noticed anything had changed. Daniel finally broke the silence himself, his voice calm, even gentle, entirely without triumph or malice, the same steady tone he might have used discussing the weather or the tide schedule. "I own Ashford Marine Holdings," he said, looking first at Eli, then briefly at Vanessa, then at Marcus, who still hadn't managed to close his mouth completely. "This yacht, and about 40 others like it currently in service around the world, all came out of a hull design I started sketching 15 years ago, not long after your mother and I separated." He said it plainly, without theatrics, the way a man explains something he's simply lived with for a long time, something that had stopped feeling remarkable to him, even if it clearly hadn't stopped feeling remarkable to everyone else standing on that deck, watching him with expressions ranging from disbelief to something closer to dread, the kind of dread that comes from realizing how much you got wrong. Eli stared at his father, several competing emotions crossing his face in quick succession, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief giving way to something that looked almost like hurt, the kind of hurt that comes from realizing a piece of your own story was quietly kept from you. "Dad," he said slowly, his voice quieter than usual, "you never told me any of this. I thought you did something with boats, like repair work, maybe some design consulting. I had no idea it was this." Daniel nodded, unsurprised by the reaction, having clearly anticipated this exact moment might eventually arrive, even if he'd never actively planned for it to happen quite like this, on his own son's birthday, in front of an audience of guests who now watched the exchange in careful, uncomfortable silence. "I never wanted you growing up feeling like my success was something you had to live up to, or something that changed how you felt about me," Daniel said carefully. "I wanted you to love me because I showed up for you, not because of what my name was worth on paper." Eli absorbed that for a long moment, clearly turning it over, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming father he'd known his whole life with the man the captain had just addressed with such obvious deference. Two versions of the same person that seemed impossible to hold in his mind at the same time. Vanessa stood frozen a few steps away, her earlier laughter feeling, in retrospect, like the cruelest thing she'd ever done without meaning to. A single reflexive sound that now felt like it might follow her around for years. She thought back, rapid and unwelcome, through 15 years of small comments she'd made about Daniel to friends, to her own mother, even occasionally to Eli, comments about how he'd never really amounted to much after the divorce, comments she'd made feeling entirely justified at the time, based on absolutely nothing except her own assumptions about a man she hadn't actually spoken to in any meaningful way in over a decade. She remembered, with a fresh wave of shame, the exact moment 15 years ago when she'd told her own sister that leaving Daniel had been the right decision because he clearly wasn't going anywhere in life, a sentence that now felt almost unbearably foolish, standing here on a yacht that quite literally belonged to him, floating on water he'd essentially reshaped the entire industry to sail on. If you've ever spent years believing something about a person that turned out to be completely wrong, something you built an entire narrative around without ever actually checking the facts, go ahead and drop a comment about it, because Vanessa is standing on that deck right now, finally understanding exactly how much of her own story about Daniel she simply made up in her own head, without ever once giving him the chance to correct it. Marcus, to his credit or perhaps to his detriment, recovered from the shock faster than either Vanessa or Eli, his composure returning almost as quickly as it had cracked in the first place. Where shame and confusion settled over the other two, something else entirely began working behind Marcus's eyes. A familiar, calculating expression Vanessa recognized from years of watching him assess every new acquaintance for potential professional advantage. The same look he wore whenever a client mentioned a promotion or a new business venture. "Daniel," Marcus said, extending a hand toward him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I had absolutely no idea. Genuinely, my apologies for the misunderstanding earlier. I clearly didn't recognize you." Daniel looked at the extended hand for a moment, before shaking it briefly, politely, without any real warmth behind the gesture, the handshake lasting only as long as basic courtesy required. Marcus, undeterred by the coolness of the response, continued smoothly, already pivoting towards something else entirely, his voice taking on the same easy charm he used with prospective clients. "You know, I've actually spent years in sales, mostly commercial equipment, and I'd genuinely love to hear more about Ashford Marine sometime, purely out of professional curiosity, of course." Daniel said nothing in response beyond a brief, non-committal nod, recognizing immediately what Marcus was actually doing beneath the surface of polite curiosity, the same instinct for opportunity that had apparently replaced any real embarrassment about what he'd just said only minutes earlier. Vanessa, standing beside Marcus, felt a fresh wave of discomfort watching her husband pivot so quickly from mockery to networking, noticing, perhaps for the first time in years, just how transparent that particular habit of his actually was when observed from the outside, a habit she'd somehow trained herself not to notice over the course of their marriage, choosing instead to see ambition where others might have seen something less flattering. Eli noticed it too, his eyes moving between his stepfather's forced smile and his father's carefully neutral expression, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably, a feeling he couldn't quite name yet but recognized instinctively as the first small crack in a family dynamic that had felt stable, if imperfect, for as long as he could remember. The rest of the charter continued that afternoon in an atmosphere considerably more subdued than anyone had expected when they first boarded that morning, laughter and conversation feeling noticeably more careful, more measured than it had at the start of the day. Eli tried, gamely, to salvage some of the celebratory spirit of his birthday, laughing with his friends near the bow, but his attention kept drifting back toward his father, who had quietly resumed his inspection duties near the stern, seemingly content to let the day continue without further explanation or drama. Exactly as unbothered as he'd been before any of it happened. Vanessa spent most of the afternoon unusually quiet, watching Daniel from a distance, replaying their entire marriage through a completely different lens than she'd used for the past 15 years, wondering, with a growing unease she couldn't shake, how much of what she'd believed about her own life had actually been built on nothing more than assumptions she'd never once bothered to question, assumptions that had shaped not just how she saw Daniel, but how she'd raised their son to see him too. As the yacht finally turned back toward the marina that evening, the sky beginning to soften into early evening color, Eli approached his father alone near the stern, away from the others, and asked quietly, his voice carrying more weight than his 22 years usually allowed, "Dad, is there anything else about your life you never told me?" Daniel looked at his son for a long moment before answering, his expression suddenly more careful and guarded than it had been all day, weighing exactly how much to say and how much still belonged to a story that wasn't entirely his to tell alone. "There's more to the story than what happened today, Eli," Daniel said finally, choosing his words slowly. "But it's not really mine to tell all of it alone." In the 2 weeks following the yacht incident, Vanessa found herself reaching for her phone more often than she had in years, drafting messages to Daniel and then deleting them before sending, uncertain how to bridge 15 years of distance now that everything she thought she understood about him had shifted overnight in a single afternoon on the water. She eventually settled on a simple text, framing it entirely around Eli, suggesting that given everything that had happened, it might be good for the three of them, or even just her and Daniel, to talk things through calmly for their son's sake. Daniel responded politely but briefly, agreeing to a short phone call rather than an in-person meeting, a small but deliberate boundary he'd learned to set over the years whenever old parts of his life resurfaced unexpectedly. When they finally spoke, Vanessa's tone carried a warmth that surprised him, an easy familiarity that felt, uncomfortably, like it belonged to a version of their relationship that had ended a long time ago and had no business resurfacing now, not after 15 years of near-total silence between them. Daniel listened carefully during that call, noting how often Vanessa circled back to Eli's well-being, but also noticing something else beneath the surface, a softness in her voice whenever she mentioned the early years of their marriage, small memories she brought up seemingly at random, memories Daniel hadn't thought about in years himself, small kitchen table conversations, and early apartment struggles neither of them had mentioned to anyone in over a decade. He didn't say anything about it directly, but he recognized the pattern clearly enough, having seen it once before in his own life, the particular ache of realizing too late what you'd actually walked away from, an ache he no longer felt himself but recognized instantly in someone else's voice. He kept his own responses measured and friendly, but carefully neutral, unwilling to give Vanessa any reason to believe there was a door left open between them, beyond simple civility for their son's sake, though he couldn't entirely ignore the quiet discomfort her warmth stirred up in him either, a discomfort he chose not to examine too closely. While Vanessa navigated her own complicated feelings, Marcus had been busy in an entirely different direction, one that had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with opportunity. His sales career, which had plateaued years earlier at a mid-level position he'd never managed to rise above despite 15 years of trying, suddenly felt, in his mind, like it had been missing exactly the kind of opportunity that had just sailed into his life completely by accident. He began mentioning Ashford Marine casually at dinner, framing his interest as simple curiosity at first, then gradually shifting toward more direct suggestions that Eli might help arrange an actual meeting with his father, something professional, something that could, as Marcus put it more than once, benefit everyone involved if Eli was just willing to help set it up. Eli found himself increasingly uncomfortable each time the subject came up, sensing exactly what his stepfather was really asking for, though Marcus never quite phrased it plainly enough to argue with directly, always wrapping the request in language that made refusing feel unreasonable. If you've ever felt caught in the middle of two people who each wanted something different from you, without either one fully saying so out loud, go ahead and drop a comment about it, because Eli is about to find himself in exactly that position, pulled in directions he never asked to be pulled in, by two people who once seemed like the two most stable figures in his entire life. Eventually, Marcus pushed hard enough that Eli finally agreed, reluctantly, to mention the idea to his father, framing it as gently as he could over a quiet dinner one evening, hoping to get the whole uncomfortable conversation over with quickly. Marcus was wondering if maybe you two could talk sometime, about business, nothing serious, just a conversation, Eli said carefully, watching his father's expression shift into something more guarded than he'd seen since the day on the yacht. Daniel set down his fork slowly, considering his words for a long moment before responding. Eli, I need you to understand something. I have no interest in doing business with Marcus, and it has nothing to do with pride or holding a grudge over what he said on that yacht. It's about the fact that a real business relationship needs trust, and everything about how this request came together tells me exactly what kind of trust that would actually be. Eli sat with that for a moment, clearly torn between understanding his father's reasoning and feeling the weight of disappointing his mother's household by delivering an answer he already knew Marcus wouldn't take well. An answer that was going to make dinner conversations at home considerably more tense in the days ahead. Daniel, watching his son's discomfort, softened his tone slightly, choosing his next words with visible care, aware of exactly how much weight this conversation carried for someone Eli's age. This isn't about punishing anyone, Eli. But I built everything I have by refusing to reward people who dismissed me the moment things looked easy for them. I'm not going to start now, even for you, because I don't actually think it would be good for you either, watching me make an exception like that. Eli nodded slowly, understanding the logic, even as it left him with an uncomfortable conversation still waiting for him back home. One he genuinely dreaded having with two people who had each, in their own way, quietly begun treating him less like a son and more like a bridge towards something they each separately wanted, something that had nothing to do with him at all. That tension finally broke wide open a week later, when Marcus, growing impatient after Eli reported Daniel's polite but firm decline, pushed the subject again at dinner, this time with less patience and considerably more irritation in his voice than he'd shown in weeks. "You didn't even really try, did you?" Marcus said, setting his glass down harder than necessary, the sound sharp enough to make Vanessa glance up from her plate. "One conversation, Eli. That's all I asked for. Your father clearly has more connections than he knows what to do with, and you couldn't even get us in the same room properly." Eli felt something inside him finally snap after weeks of carefully absorbing pressure from both directions, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he spoke to his stepfather with real, unfiltered frustration. "I'm not your business connection, Marcus. I'm your stepson, and I've spent the last 2 weeks feeling like the only reason either of you wants to talk to me is because of who my father turned out to be, not because of anything else." The table went silent, Vanessa's fork frozen halfway to her plate, her eyes moving quickly between her son and her husband, clearly caught off guard by the sudden sharpness in Eli's voice, a sharpness she'd never once heard from him before. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, something defensive already forming, but Eli continued before he could, his voice steadier now, though clearly still shaking with emotion underneath. "And Mom, I know you've been calling Dad. I know it's supposedly about me, but I'm not stupid. I can see how you talk about him differently now than you ever did before. I don't know what either of you actually want from him anymore, but I'm tired of being the reason you're both trying to get to him." Vanessa's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and something rawer underneath, and before she could find the right words to respond, her own phone buzzed sharply on the table beside her, the screen lighting up with a name that made her breath catch. It was Daniel. He almost never called her directly, always preferring the careful distance of a text message first, and seeing his name appear now, at this exact moment, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her, uncertain whether it meant something good or something that was about to make this entire evening even harder to sit through than it already had become. Vanessa stepped away from the table to answer the call, her hands not quite steady as she pressed the phone to her ear, bracing herself for she wasn't entirely sure what, her heart still pounding from the argument she'd just witnessed between her son and her husband, an argument that had left the whole table sitting in uncomfortable silence. Daniel's voice on the other end was calm but unmistakably direct, without any of the careful warmth she'd grown used to over their recent conversations. "Vanessa, I need to say something clearly, and I need you to actually hear it," he began. "Eli texted me a few minutes ago, upset, and from what he described, I think it's time I said plainly what I should have said the first time you called me. I'm not interested in reconnecting, not as anything more than Eli's parents coexisting peacefully. And I'm not interested in doing business with Marcus either. Not now, not later, no matter how many ways that request gets repackaged." Vanessa stood frozen in the hallway outside the dining room, the phone pressed hard against her ear, feeling 15 years of quiet hope and unspoken assumptions collapse in the space of a single, measured sentence. Daniel continued before she could find a response, his tone firm but not unkind, the voice of a man who had clearly thought carefully about exactly what he wanted to say before making this call, not something he'd decided on impulse in a moment of frustration. "I understand wanting to reconnect for Eli's sake, and I'm genuinely glad to keep working on that, calmly, as co-parents. But I need you to be honest with yourself about what's actually happening here, because our son is caught in the middle of it, and he doesn't deserve that." Vanessa's throat tightened, unable to argue with anything Daniel had just said, recognizing the truth in it even as it stung more than she wanted to admit out loud, a truth she'd been quietly avoiding for weeks by telling herself it was only ever about Eli. She managed a quiet, "You're right," before the call ended, and she stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of Marcus and Eli still arguing quietly in the next room, feeling, for the first time in 15 years, the full weight of a choice she'd made a long time ago finally settling permanently into place, with no more room left for wondering what might have been, or what a different version of this story could have looked like. If you've ever had someone calmly say the one true thing you'd been avoiding hearing for years, go ahead and drop a comment about it, because Vanessa just got that exact moment from the one person she least expected to be the one brave enough to say it plainly, without cruelty, without raising his voice, just quiet, unmistakable clarity. 2 days later, Daniel called Eli directly, asking if he'd be willing to meet in person, just the two of them, somewhere quiet away from the tension that had been building at home for weeks now, tension that had started to feel heavier than either of them wanted to keep carrying silently. They met at a small waterfront cafe near the marina, choosing a table outside where they could watch the boats coming and going, and Daniel, without prompting, finally told his son the full story he'd only ever offered in careful fragments before. He explained honestly how the divorce had happened, admitting that some of it had genuinely been his own shortcomings, long hours at the boatyard, an obsession with a hull design nobody believed in, including, understandably, his own wife at the time, who had every reason to want more stability than he could offer her back then, more security than a stubborn dream could promise anyone. He didn't paint Vanessa as a villain, acknowledging plainly that her frustration 15 years ago hadn't come from nowhere, even if the way things had unfolded since had complicated things considerably. Eli listened closely, hearing, for the first time, a version of his parents' history that felt honest rather than carefully managed for his benefit, the kind of honesty that made him trust his father even more than he already had, rather than less. Daniel also told him about the years that followed, the quiet, grinding work of turning one stubborn idea into something real. Years spent with no guarantee any of it would ever amount to anything. Years he deliberately kept separate from his relationship with Eli, because he never wanted his son to feel like love and success were somehow tied together in their family, that one had to be earned before the other could be trusted. "I wanted you to know me as your dad first," Daniel said, looking out at the water rather than directly at his son, his voice quieter than usual. "Not as somebody's business opportunity, and not as proof that Mom made a mistake, just as your father." Eli sat with that for a long moment, something in his chest finally settling after weeks of confusion and tension, and told his father, quietly, that this conversation meant more to him than anything that had happened on that yacht, more than the money, more than the company, more than any of it. Because this was the first time in his entire life he felt like he actually knew the whole man sitting across from him. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa quietly stepped back from her attempts to reconnect with Daniel beyond the basic, respectful coexistence necessary for Eli's sake, finally accepting, without further argument, that whatever door she'd once hoped might reopen had genuinely and permanently closed, and that continuing to knock on it would only make things harder for the son they both loved. Marcus, for his part, grew noticeably more distant after learning that Daniel's decision had been made clear and final, his interest in family gatherings cooling considerably once it became obvious there was no professional opportunity left to pursue, a shift that Eli noticed and quietly filed away as its own kind of answer to a question he'd never actually needed to ask out loud. The household Eli returned to each week felt different now, not broken exactly, but honest in a way it hadn't been before the yacht, everyone finally operating with the same information instead of half-truths and quiet hopes nobody had said out loud. Daniel, for his part, returned to the steady rhythm of the life he'd built for himself, inspecting yachts in simple work clothes, running Ashford Marine Holdings with the same quiet, unassuming focus that had carried him through 15 years of building something extraordinary out of nothing, never once needing the world to notice in order to feel like his work meant something. He started spending more deliberate time with Eli, not extravagant trips or expensive gestures, but simple, ordinary time, weekend breakfasts and long walks along the marina, the kind of relationship he'd always wanted with his son regardless of how much money either of them ever had. Months after that birthday charter, sitting together on the deck of the same yacht where everything had unraveled and then quietly come back together, Eli turned to his father and said, simply, that he was proud of him, not for the company or the money, but for staying exactly who he was the entire time, even when nobody was watching closely enough to notice, even when it would have been easier to be someone else entirely. Daniel smiled at that, a real, unguarded smile, and told his son that of everything Ashford Marine Holdings had ever built, that single sentence was worth more to him than all of it combined, more than every yacht in service, more than every contract signed. If this story reminded you of anyone quietly building something real while nobody was paying attention, or anyone who's ever had to say a hard truth out loud simply because it needed saying, take a moment and hit that subscribe button, because somewhere out there, someone deserves to hear their own version of this story too, and to know that staying true to who they are will eventually be worth it, even when it feels like nobody's noticing yet.